The storm hit hard, its icy fingers clawing through every crack in the walls. Mary stood at the hearth, the warmth of the fire her only ally. As the wind howled outside, but she had a secret, a recipe passed down from the old country. A pie made with nothing but water, flour, and a dream of better days. Before we dive into Mary's struggle, tell us where you're watching from, and if stories of survival and resilience move you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale could be just as heart-wrenching. The wind was fierce that November evening, a biting cold that made Mary's fingers stiff as she tried to knead the dough. Her husband, John, was out in the fields, trying to salvage what was left of their crop after the last dust storm. The children huddled close to the fire, their faces pale from weeks of sickness. The storm had come earlier than expected, and the air in the small cabin felt heavy with despair. There was no one left to rely on but each other, and even then, Mary could feel the weight of isolation pressing down on her shoulders. The house had been built from the remains of the old barn, the walls notched with care by John himself. It had withstood many storms, but the wind this time seemed different, almost as though it carried the promise of something worse. There were whispers among the neighbors about the worsening drought. The soil had become so dry that it cracked underfoot. And yet, here Mary stood, a mother of two, trying to keep their spirits up in the face of an unrelenting winter. She looked down at the pie crust in front of her, the dough as thin as it could get without falling apart. It was all she could offer the family, a warm meal, in a world that felt cold, empty, and uncertain. The last flour had been traded months ago, the sugar was long gone, and the tin canisters of beans and potatoes were dwindling. But this pie, made with only the barest ingredients, water, flour, a pinch of salt, would remind them that they were still here, still fighting. As she placed the dough into the pan, the door creaked open, and John entered, his face weathered and tired. "The fields are gone, Mary," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The wheat didn't stand a chance." Mary nodded, not knowing what else to say. There was nothing left to give. The children had begun to cough again, and the fire barely held against the relentless cold. Yet she couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope as the warmth of the oven began to fill the room. Mary had heard the stories of this pie long before she had arrived in the plains, tales passed down from her own mother, who had grown up in the hills of Kentucky. In times of hardship, when the land refused to give and the pantry was bare, the women in her family had learned to make do with what little they had. Water pie, a simple creation of flour, water, and salt, was a desperate dish, but one that had carried them through many dark nights. The ingredients were simple, but the meaning behind them was profound. It was not just the pie that sustained them, but the tradition of resilience, the belief that even when there was nothing left, a meal could still be made. Mary thought back to her mother, who had taught her to cook with whatever scraps the earth gave. There was always something, always a way to stretch the smallest morsels into a meal, no matter the season. As the pie began to bake, the warmth from the oven spread throughout the cabin. The children stopped coughing for a moment, their faces lighting up with the smell of food. Mary smiled to herself, a brief moment of peace in the chaos of the world outside. Her hands, though worn and cracked, worked quickly to gather what little wood she had left for the fire. She had a feeling the storm was not over yet. The sky had darkened and the wind had picked up again, signaling that the worst was still to come. But tonight, for this small window of time, she had done something. She had fed them. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As the hours wore on, the wind continued its relentless assault on the cabin. It howled like a living thing, scratching at the walls and rattling the windows. Inside, the warmth from the oven was starting to fade, and Mary had to move the children closer to the hearth. John sat quietly by the door, staring into the flickering flames, his mind clearly elsewhere. It had been weeks since the last rain, and the land outside was now a brittle wasteland. Every day, it felt like the earth was taking its last breath. Mary tried to keep her thoughts focused on the pie in the oven, on the small acts of survival that kept them moving forward. But as the wind grew stronger, her mind wandered to darker places. What if this was it? What if this storm was the final blow, the one that would drive them from this land? They had already lost so much. The cattle, the crops, the sense of security that had once come with the land they had, settled on. Now, with every passing day, survival seemed more like a slow march toward a bitter end. The children were silent now, their small forms huddled together for warmth. Little Anna, the youngest, was the first to speak. "Mama, is the storm going to take us away like the others?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mary didn't know how to answer. She couldn't promise her daughter that they would survive this one. She didn't know if they would. The world outside felt hostile, as if it was conspiring to take everything they had. But what could she say? "No, sweetheart," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "We're stronger than the storm. We always have been." John turned toward them, his expression dark. "We can't outrun it, Mary. We can only face it." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Mary nodded, but inside, a flicker of doubt crept up. She had always believed they could make it through, that with hard work and faith, they would persevere. But now, in the face of this relentless storm, the path ahead was less certain. What if it wasn't enough? What if it never was? She looked down at the pie, the last remaining symbol of her defiance. She had made something warm, something real. The pie had browned nicely, its crust now golden and crisp. When it was ready, she pulled it from the oven and set it down on the table, where the children gathered eagerly, their eyes wide with anticipation. There, in the dim light of the cabin, surrounded by the sound of wind and the smell of baking dough, Mary felt the weight of everything that had come before. But she also felt something else, a quiet resolve. She had done her best, and that was all anyone could ask for. The pie was barely finished when the storm took a turn for the worse. The wind, which had been relentless, now seemed to carry something more, something like a warning. The howls outside were joined by the sharp, eerie whistle of the wind funneling through cracks in the cabin. It sounded like a banshee, a death cry from the earth itself. John stood and walked to the window, peering out through the frost-covered glass. The snow had begun to fall in thick sheets, blinding in its intensity. "They're saying the worst is coming," he muttered. "It's already been 3 days. This ain't stopping any time soon." His voice was low, strained by the weight of his thoughts. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. The land was dying. They all knew it, even if no one had yet spoken it aloud. Mary watched him from her seat by the fire, her hands still wrapped around the warm pie dish. The children had eaten hungrily, but their faces now reflected the weariness that came with being stuck in one place for too long. Mary knew it was only a matter of time before they ran out of wood, before the supplies dwindled further and the cold set in with no hope of relief. The pie had been the last of her flour, her last offering of comfort. "We can't stay here much longer," John said, turning away from the window. "We've got no feed for the cattle, the well's dry, and the dust is only getting worse. We might have to head to town." Mary felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had heard the whispers of other families leaving, heading west or south to find new land. Some had already gone, abandoning everything they had built. But Mary couldn't bring herself to leave. This land had been their home, their dream. How could she let go of that, even now, when it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers? "But where would we go?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's always the road to Texas," John replied. "It's not far. Maybe we can find something there. We can't keep fighting this storm. There's no more fight left." Mary stared into the fire, her mind racing. She thought of her father's land back in Missouri, of her mother's face when they'd left. Her father had never been one to turn back, but her mother had always known when to walk away. It was the same now. The earth was empty, and they had nothing left but the land's cruel reminder of their fight. She stood slowly and crossed to the window. Outside, the snow was falling thick and fast, but behind that storm, a new decision lay waiting, one she could no longer avoid. It wasn't about surviving the storm anymore. It was about deciding what came next. "I'll pack," she said quietly, her voice firm. "We leave at dawn." John looked at her, his face uncertain. He had feared this decision, knew that leaving meant losing everything they had. But in her eyes, he saw a quiet strength, one that he had never doubted in her before. He nodded slowly, and together they began to prepare for the unknown that awaited. The storm was still raging when dawn broke over the desolate landscape, the gray sky giving way to more white, thick, and unyielding. Mary had never seen the world so quiet, so completely covered in a blanket of snow. The wind had stopped howling for the moment, but the eerie stillness was more unsettling than the shrieking gusts had been. The earth seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next blow. Inside the cabin, Mary moved about with quiet urgency. The children were still asleep, their small bodies curled up together for warmth under a pile of blankets. She paused for a moment to watch them, her heart heavy with the decision that had been made, the same decision she had been avoiding for weeks. They would leave. They had no choice. She packed what little they had left, a few clothes, the last of the dried beans, some tools. John was outside, tending to the horse and preparing for the long journey. She could hear him working, but the thought of facing the unknown without the comfort of home made her stomach tighten. She had always known hardship, but leaving everything behind felt different, like cutting a piece of herself off and leaving it in the snow. As she closed the last of their belongings into a worn leather bag, her gaze drifted to the hearth. The fire had burned down to embers, the warmth of it gone. The pie, still warm when they had eaten it last night, was now nothing more than a cold memory, a brief taste of something better, something familiar in a world that had been reshaped by loss. The door creaked open, and John stepped inside, his face drawn tight from the cold. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she saw in them a mix of exhaustion and resolve. He wasn't a man given to many words, but his actions spoke volumes. They had both reached this moment by following a path that led only forward. "It's ready," he said, his voice low. Mary nodded, though her chest felt tight with a weight she couldn't name. She reached for her coat, pulled it tightly around her shoulders, and made her way to the door. The children were stirring now, their eyes squinting against the dim light that filtered in through the cracks of the cabin. The silence between them felt thicker than it had the night before, as if they all knew what leaving meant, but didn't know how to say goodbye to the place that had once been their home. John tied the horse to the small wagon, his movements practiced, steady. Mary moved toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of hooves and wagon wheels creaking on the frozen ground was all she could hear as she stood beside him. "It'll be hard, Mary," John said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I don't know what we'll find out there, but I do know that we can't stay here. We can't fight it anymore." Mary stood still for a long moment, watching the horizon. The land was barren, but there was something else there, something she couldn't quite name. The endless stretch of land that had once promised abundance now felt like an unwelcoming stranger. Yet in the stillness of the morning, she realized something she hadn't before. Even in the face of all this loss, there was still something worth fighting for. Not the land, not the house, but the family that had shared it with her. They had made it through together, and they would continue to do so. Turning to John, she spoke softly, her words filled with a quiet strength. "We leave together, that's all we can do, and we'll find a way." John didn't reply, but he didn't need to. The air between them was filled with the unspoken understanding that the journey ahead, whatever it may hold, would be borne by both of them. The wind had taken much from them already, but it couldn't take their resolve. The children were ready now, bundled up in their coats, clutching each other against the cold. They were not old enough to understand fully, but they knew that their lives were about to change. And so, without another word, the family climbed into the wagon, the cold steel of the wheels creaking as the horse began to move. The journey would be long, and the road would be hard. But with each mile, the horizon would open up before them, and though the land was barren, there was hope to be found in the unknown. And somewhere beyond the dust and the wind, Mary knew that they would find a new place to rebuild, not just a home, but a future, one step at a time. And as the wagon creaked forward, disappearing into the white expanse, the storm finally began to pass, leaving behind a quiet emptiness and the first rays of sunlight piercing through the clouds.